The woods were unnervingly silent that night, save for the occasional whisper of the wind weaving through the skeletal branches. A dense fog clung to the forest floor, coiling around the gnarled roots like a living thing. Olivia tightened her grip on the flashlight as its beam flickered, threatening to plunge her into darkness. She had followed the trail of footprints leading into the forest for over an hour now, her desperation eclipsing her fear. It started earlier that day when her younger brother, Max, had wandered off during their family's camping trip. They'd been warned by the ranger to stay near the campsite. "Strange things happen out there after dark," he'd said, his face pale under the shadow of his ranger hat. Olivia had rolled her eyes at the time, dismissing it as an attempt to spook tourists. Now, with night fully draped over the forest and the path back to the campsite erased by shadows, she regretted not listening. The footprints ended abruptly near a patch of blackened soil. The ground smelled faintly of sulfur, and the air felt heavier here, oppressive. Her flashlight flickered again, and then, without warning, it went out. Panic rose in her chest as she smacked the flashlight against her palm, trying to coax it back to life. A faint sound drifted through the trees, freezing her in place. It was a child's laughter, high-pitched, melodic, but wrong somehow. She swung around, her eyes straining against the dark. "Max?" she called out, her voice trembling. The laughter ceased. For a moment, the woods were silent again, but the silence was not comforting. It felt alive, watching her, waiting. A twig snapped behind her, and she whirled around just as the flashlight sputtered back to life. The beam illuminated a small figure standing a few feet away. It looked like Max. Same messy blonde hair, same blue hoodie, but his face was obscured by the shadows. Relief surged through Olivia, and she took a hesitant step forward. "Max! Oh, thank God, where have you?" Her words died in her throat as he lifted his face. His eyes were completely black, like twin voids that seemed to absorb the light. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, far too wide for his face. He tilted his head, regarding her with a curious expression. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice echoing strangely, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. Olivia stumbled back, her mind reeling. That wasn't Max. It couldn't be. The thing that looked like her brother took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. She turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing in her grip as she crashed through the underbrush. The laughter started again, louder this time, and it was coming from all directions. Every step she took seemed to echo twice, as though someone or something was running alongside her, just out of sight. The forest felt endless. No matter how far she ran, the trees remained the same, towering and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. Her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, but the sound of footsteps closing in behind her spurred her onward. She didn't dare look back. Finally, she burst into a clearing and collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her ragged breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then she saw it. A cabin, half hidden by the fog, its windows glowing faintly with an amber light. She didn't question her luck. Rising unsteadily to her feet, she stumbled toward it. The door creaked open before she could knock, revealing a dimly lit interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the room smelled of wood smoke and something sweet, like honey. An old woman sat in a rocking chair by the fire, her face lined with age and her eyes sharp and knowing. "You've been followed," the woman said, her voice calm but grave. Olivia froze in the doorway, unsure whether to step inside or turn and flee. The old woman beckoned her closer. "They don't like fire," she said, gesturing toward the hearth. "Stay here and you'll be safe." Olivia hesitated but then stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. The warmth of the fire was a balm against the cold fear that clung to her. The old woman didn't say anything else, simply rocking in her chair and humming softly. But Olivia noticed something strange. The shadows in the room didn't behave as they should. They stretched and writhed, creeping along the walls like living things. "Who are you?" Olivia asked, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman stopped humming and fixed her with a piercing gaze. "I keep the woods in balance," she said. "But balance requires sacrifice." Before Olivia could ask what she meant, the shadows on the walls surged toward her. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. The last thing she saw was the old woman's face, serene and unchanging, as the firelight dimmed and the shadows closed in. The next morning, the rangers found the campsite abandoned. Olivia, Max, and their parents were never seen again. Locals say the woods are cursed, and those who venture too far often disappear. Sometimes on quiet nights, campers report hearing laughter in the distance, high-pitched and melodic, but wrong somehow.
Story number 2.
The forest wasn't on any map, and that was its first warning. Its entrance was hidden behind a wall of dense pines, the kind that blocked out the sunlight even at midday. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. Locals called it the shifting pines and warned against going in, but urban legends have a way of luring the curious. Maya and her friends, Alex and Jamie, weren't easily scared. They had spent the past month visiting supposedly haunted places for their vlog, and nothing had come close to living up to the hype. Tonight, they were determined to prove the shifting pines was just another overblown tale. "Look," Alex said as they crossed into the forest, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "It's just a bunch of trees. No monsters, no ghosts. Boring." Jamie laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, let's not jinx it, okay?" Maya stayed silent, Subier, her gaze sweeping the shadows. Something about this forest felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too deep. It wasn't natural. As they walked deeper, the path began to twist unnaturally, curving back on itself and narrowing until the trees pressed in on all sides. Alex joked about it being a forest funhouse, but his voice wavered, betraying his unease. Their flashlights seemed weaker here, their beams swallowed by the dark. "Does anyone else feel like we're walking in circles?" Jamie asked, glancing over his shoulder. "I swear we passed that tree before." "It's just your imagination," Alex said, though he sounded far from convinced. "Let's keep moving." An hour later, the mood had shifted. The joking stopped as they realized the forest was toying with them. The path disappeared entirely, leaving them surrounded by identical trees. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the pale light of their flashlights. Then came the whispering. At first, it was so faint they thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, distinct. Multiple voices, speaking in hushed, overlapping tones. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. Taunting, beckoning. "Who's there?" Maya called out, her voice shaking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of their hearts. Then, a scream. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, high-pitched and filled with terror. It cut through the silence like a blade, echoing in their ears long after it stopped. Maya's blood ran cold. "We have to go back," Jamie said, his voice panicked. "We shouldn't be here." "We don't even know which way back is," Alex said, spinning in circles, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "We're..." The scream came again, closer this time. Alex swore and broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush. Maya and Jamie had no choice but to follow, their breaths ragged as branches clawed at their faces and arms. They stumbled into a clearing, the ground soft and spongy beneath their feet. In the center was a massive tree, its bark blackened and oozing a dark, sap-like substance. The air here was suffocating, thick with a metallic tang that made their stomachs churn. "What is that?" Jamie whispered, staring at the tree. Carved into its trunk were symbols, jagged and crude, that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at for too long. Alex stepped closer, drawn to it despite the primal fear gnawing at his gut. "It's humming," he said, placing a hand on the bark. "Alex, don't!" Maya shouted, but it was too late. The ground beneath them shuddered, and a low growl rumbled through the air. Alex jerked his hand back, but his palm was coated in the dark sap. It spread quickly, crawling up his arm like living ink. He screamed, clawing at his skin, but the substance only moved faster, covering his body. Maya and Jamie watched in horror as Alex's screams turned guttural, inhuman. His limbs twisted at impossible angles, his bones cracking audibly. His face contorted, his eyes sinking into his skull as new ones opened along his arms and chest, wide and unblinking. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from Alex's open mouth. "Maya, run!" Jamie yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. They fled the clearing, Alex's distorted form chasing them, its movement a jerky, horrifying crawl. The whispers followed, seeping into their minds, repeating their names in a sickening chant. Maya tripped, her flashlight tumbling to the ground and going out. Jamie stopped to help her, but the creature was already upon them. Its many eyes glistened in the dark as it reached for Jamie, dragging him back toward the clearing. "Jamie!" Maya screamed, but she couldn't move. She could only watch as the shadows swallowed him whole. Alone and trembling, Maya crawled away, the forest closing in around her. The trees seemed alive now, their branches reaching for her, their bark splitting open to reveal staring eyes. The whispers filled her head, driving out all coherent thought. When the rangers found her the next day, she was sitting at the edge of the forest, her eyes wide and unseeing. She spoke only one word over and over: run.
Story number 3.
The storm came suddenly, an unrelenting wall of rain and wind that battered the tiny town of Wrenwood and left its streets eerily deserted. The power went out just before midnight, plunging the area into a darkness so complete it felt as though the world itself had vanished. But for Jonah, the blackout wasn't the worst part. It was the knocking. It started as a soft rapping at his back door, so faint that he almost dismissed it as the wind. Jonah lived alone in a house on the edge of the forest, far from neighbors or passing traffic. The isolation was usually comforting, but tonight it felt suffocating. He paused his candlelit reading and glanced toward the kitchen. The knocking came again, louder this time, deliberate and steady. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to ignore it, but curiosity tugged at him. Who would be out in this weather? Jonah approached the door cautiously, peering through the small frosted window. Nothing but the dark outline of the forest beyond. Still, the knocking persisted. It didn't stop, didn't grow more insistent, just the same rhythmic tap, tap, tap. "Hello," he called, his voice sounding hollow in the empty house. The knocking stopped abruptly. Jonah waited, his breath caught in his throat, but there was no response. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. "Don't open it." The thought came unbidden, primal, but he ignored it. He twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The porch was empty. Rain poured down in sheets and the wind howled, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no retreating figure, just the forest swaying in the storm. Jonah shivered and shut the door, locking it this time. As he turned to leave the kitchen, he froze. The knocking resumed. This time it came from the window above the sink, a small, rapid tapping, like fingernails on glass. Jonah's stomach churned as he turned slowly, his candle casting long shadows on the walls. The window was slightly ajar, the latch undone. It had been locked earlier. He was sure of it. He stepped closer, peering out into the rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a brief moment. Jonah's breath caught. He'd seen something, or someone, standing just beyond the tree line. A tall figure with impossibly long limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. The candle sputtered out, plunging the house into darkness. Jonah fumbled for his phone, the weak glow of its screen his only source of light. His hands shook as he dialed 911, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. He was too far from the nearest tower, and the storm had likely knocked out any chance of a connection. The knocking began again, louder now, coming from the front door. Jonah's heart pounded as he backed away, his eyes darting toward the sound. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was pounding, as though something heavy was trying to break through. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The pounding stopped, replaced by silence. Then a voice answered, low and raspy, coming from just beyond the door. "Let me in." Jonah's blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't human, it couldn't be. It was too deep, too distorted, as though it were being dragged through layers of static. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table as he clutched his phone like a lifeline. The voice spoke again, this time from the living room window. "Let me in." Jonah spun around, his phone's light casting weak shadows across the walls. The curtains were drawn, but he could see the outline of a figure standing just outside the glass. It was tall, impossibly so, its shoulders nearly brushing the top of the window frame. Its face, or what should have been a face, was pressed against the glass, leaving a smear of something dark and oily. "Go away!" Jonah screamed, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It stayed there, motionless except for its head, which tilted slowly, almost curiously. Then it whispered so softly Jonah wasn't sure he'd heard it right. "You invited me." Jonah's mind reeled. He hadn't invited anyone, had he? His thoughts raced back to earlier that evening before the storm, when he'd been outside stacking firewood. He'd found a strange object in the yard, a bundle of sticks tied with red thread, with symbols carved into the wood. It had seemed harmless, almost decorative, but now his stomach churned with dread. The figure began tapping on the window, faster and faster, until the sound was a deafening cacophony. Jonah backed into the corner of the room, his phone slipping from his grasp. The tapping stopped suddenly, and the house fell silent. Then the front door creaked open. Jonah's scream was swallowed by the storm as the darkness rushed in.
Story number 4.
The Grey Hollow Woods had always been a source of fear and fascination for the nearby town of Ashwick. Legends spoke of a family that vanished there centuries ago, their house swallowed by the earth, leaving behind only a faint clearing where nothing grew. The locals swore the woods were cursed, and hunters claimed to hear whispers and see fleeting shadows even in the daylight. So naturally, when Lila, her boyfriend Darren, and their friend Carly wanted a thrill, they decided to camp there overnight. "This place isn't cursed," Darren said, rolling his eyes as he unpacked the tent. "It's just trees and stories. People love scaring themselves." "Maybe, but it's still creepy," Carly said, glancing around the towering trees that seemed to lean toward them like curious spectators. The sun was setting fast, the sky bruising with shades of purple and gray. Lila shivered despite the warmth of her jacket, and she had felt it the moment they crossed into the woods, a sense of being watched. By the time they had a fire going, darkness had settled in fully. The world outside their small circle of light was a wall of black. They laughed and told ghost stories, the tension easing as the night wore on. Then the first scream shattered the night. It was distant but chilling, high-pitched and raw. The three froze, their eyes locking in shared fear. "Did you hear that?" Carly whispered, clutching her jacket tightly. "Probably just an animal," Darren said, though his voice wavered. "Coyotes or something." Lila shook her head. "That wasn't an animal. It sounded human." The scream came again, closer this time, and joined by a low, guttural groan that seemed to vibrate the air. Darren grabbed the flashlight and pointed it into the trees. "Stay here," he said, his bravado slipping slightly. "No way," Lila said, standing. "You're not going out there alone." "Me neither," Carly added, her voice trembling. The three of them moved cautiously into the woods, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a knife. The silence between the screams was worse than the sounds themselves, thick and heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. They didn't have to walk far to find the source. In a small clearing, they found a crude circle carved into the ground, its edges marked with strange symbols. At its center lay a pile of animal bones, arranged in a way that seemed deliberate. The smell of decay hung in the air. "What the hell is this?" Darren muttered, stepping closer. Lila grabbed his arm. "Don't. Let's go back to the camp." Before they could move, a new sound emerged from the trees. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling them just beyond the reach of the flashlight. "Who's there?" Darren shouted, swinging the light around. The footsteps stopped. Then the whispering began. It came from every direction, a chorus of low, overlapping voices speaking in a language none of them understood. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Lila turned, her heart pounding, and saw a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in unnatural angles. Its face was featureless, a pale, smooth expanse that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. "Run!" Lila managed to choke out. They bolted back toward the campsite, branches slapping at their faces and tearing at their clothes. The whispers followed, growing louder, almost frantic. When they reached the camp, the fire had been extinguished, and the tent lay shredded, as though torn apart by claws. "We have to get out of here," Carly sobbed, clutching Lila's arm. Darren fumbled for the car keys in his pocket. "Let's go now." But as they turned to run, they saw it again. The figure stood between them and the path, its head tilted as if curious. This time, it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their movements jerky and inhuman, their blank faces turned toward the trio. Lila felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and she looked down to see dark, root-like tendrils snaking through the dirt, wrapping around her ankles. She screamed as they tightened, pulling her down. "Help!" she cried. But Darren and Carly were already being dragged in different directions, their screams echoing in the night. The last thing Lila saw before the darkness consumed her was one of the figures leaning down, its featureless face inches from hers. It whispered something, a single word, in a voice that seemed to echo inside her skull. When the Rangers found the campsite the next morning, there was no sign of Lila, Darren, or Carly. Only the torn tent, the extinguished fire, and 3 deep, human-shaped impressions in the clearing, as though something had pulled them into the earth. The forest grew quieter after that. The whispers stopped. For now.
Story number 5.
The wind howled as Eric drove the long, winding road that led to Blackridge Pass, a notorious shortcut through the mountains. The townsfolk warned him against taking it, saying the road was cursed. But Eric was in a hurry. His boss wouldn't tolerate another late report, and the alternative route would add hours to his trip. The road's reputation didn't bother him. Stories about haunted travelers and strange lights were just that. Stories. He'd heard it all before. Ghosts didn't exist. As Eric climbed higher into the mountains, the dense forest on either side of the road seemed to press closer, its branches casting claw-like shadows across his car. The rain started as a drizzle, quickly escalating into a downpour that battered his windshield. "Great," he muttered, squinting against the streaks of water and the inadequate glow of his headlights. It wasn't long before he noticed something odd. The road ahead shimmered in the rain, almost like it was wet glass. His tires made no sound as they rolled across it. The forest grew unnaturally still, the usual symphony of nocturnal creatures replaced by an oppressive silence. Then he saw her. A figure appeared on the side of the road, standing still in the pouring rain. She was drenched, her pale dress clinging to her thin frame, her head bowed. Eric slowed, rolling down his window. "Hey," he called out. "You okay? Need a ride?" The woman didn't respond. She raised her head slowly, her face obscured by strands of dark, wet hair. Something about her made Eric's stomach churn, but he couldn't just leave her there. He pulled over and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. You'll catch your death out here." She moved without a word, her movements slow and deliberate. The air inside the car seemed to drop several degrees as she settled into the seat. Eric glanced at her, uneasy, but she kept her head turned toward the window. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Just drive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and merged back onto the road. Minutes passed in uncomfortable silence, the only sound the rain hammering against the car. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her presence felt heavy, like she was sucking the air out of the space. Finally, he risked a glance at her. "Are you?" Her head snapped toward him, and Eric's words died in his throat. Her face was wrong. The features were human but distorted, stretched in ways that defied logic. Her eyes were wide and black, empty pits that seemed to swallow the dim light of the dashboard. "You shouldn't have stopped," she hissed, her voice layered with an echo that didn't belong. Eric slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. The car skidded to a halt, and when he turned to look at the passenger seat, she was gone. He sat there, trembling, trying to convince himself it was some kind of hallucination. The rain had stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before. And then he noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood in the middle of the road, directly behind his car. It was her. She was closer now, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Eric's blood ran cold as she started walking toward him, her movements jerky, almost mechanical. "No, no, no," he muttered, throwing the car into gear. The tires squealed as he sped away, the figure growing smaller in the mirror. He thought he was safe until he heard the whisper. "Don't look back." The voice came from right beside him. Eric screamed, jerking the wheel. The car spun out of control, slamming into a tree. The airbags deployed, the impact rattling him to the core. When he opened his eyes, he was alone in the car. His hands shook as he fumbled with the door, stumbling out into the night. The forest was still, the road empty. But when he turned back to the car, he saw her standing by the driver's seat, her face pressed against the window, staring at him with those impossibly black eyes. Eric ran. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest gas station hours later, his clothes soaked and his body trembling. The attendant called the police, but when they searched the area, there was no sign of the woman or Eric's car. The next day, a trucker found the vehicle abandoned on Blackridge Pass. The driver's seat was soaked with water, and deep gouges like claw marks marred the inside of the windows. No one ever took Blackridge Pass again.
Story number 6.
The town of Ravenswood had always avoided the Ironwood Asylum, a decaying relic perched on a hill surrounded by dense, shadowed woods. It had been abandoned for decades, its history a grim collection of rumors about mistreatment, strange experiments, and mass disappearances. Most people stayed away, but for thrill-seekers like Ben, Alyssa, and Mark, it was the perfect place to spend Halloween night. "It's just an old building," Ben said as they approached the rusting gates. "Creepy," Sure, but it's not like it's haunted. Famous last words, Alyssa muttered, adjusting her flashlight. The beam illuminated the cracked stone walls, ivy crawling through the shattered windows. Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed. Yeah, because ghosts are totally real. Let's go inside and prove it's just a bunch of urban legends. They pried open the front doors, their hinges screeching in protest. The air inside was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes swirled in the beams of their flashlights as they stepped into the cavernous lobby. A broken chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals glinting like teeth. Okay, we're here, said, trying to mask his unease. Let's split up and check it out. Alyssa shot him a glare. Are you insane? Splitting up is how people die in horror movies. Mark rolled his eyes. Fine, we'll stick together. Happy? They moved cautiously through the asylum's winding halls, their footsteps echoing ominously. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing unsettling messages carved into the plaster. Leave while you can, and they watch. Creepy, Alyssa whispered, running her fingers over one of the carvings, but probably just from other idiots who came here. The further they ventured, the stranger things became. The temperature dropped, their breath fogging in the dim light. Whispers began to follow them, faint and indistinct, as though someone were speaking just out of earshot. Do you hear that? Alyssa asked, clutching Mark's arm. It's just the wind, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Then came the laughter. High-pitched and childlike, it echoed down the corridor, sending a chill down their spines. They froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. There shouldn't be anyone else here, Ben said, gripping his flashlight tightly. Maybe it's another group, Mark offered, though he didn't sound sure. The laughter came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of small, rapid footsteps. They turned to see a shadow dart across the end of the hall, too fast to be human. Let's get out of here, Alyssa said, panic rising in her voice. No arguments here, Ben muttered. They retraced their steps, but the asylum seemed to have shifted. Hallways that should have led back to the lobby now ended in brick walls or twisted in unfamiliar directions. Doors that had been open were now locked or led to empty voids. It's like the place is alive, Alyssa whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Don't be ridiculous, Mark snapped, though sweat beaded on his forehead. We just got turned around. We'll find the way out. But the asylum wasn't done with them. The whispers grew louder, clearer, forming words. Join us. Ben's flashlight flickered and went out. He fumbled with it, cursing as Alyssa screamed. A figure stood at the end of the hall, its face obscured by shadows. It was tall and thin, its arms unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Run, Mark shouted, grabbing Alyssa's hand and pulling her down the hall. Ben followed, his breathing ragged. The figure didn't chase them, but its presence was everywhere. Doors slammed shut ahead of them, forcing them to change direction. The whispers became screams, the air thick with the stench of rot. Shadows danced on the walls, writhing and twisting like living things. Finally, they stumbled into what seemed to be a common room. Broken furniture littered the floor, and rusted chains hung from the ceiling. At the center of the room was a single wheelchair, its leather straps worn and frayed. We need to barricade the door, Ben said, shoving a heavy cabinet against it. Whatever that thing is, we can't let it get in. Mark was about to respond when Alyssa gasped, pointing to the wheelchair. It was moving on its own, its wheels squeaking as it turned to face them. Slowly, it began to roll toward them, though no one was pushing it. That's it, Mark said, backing away. We're dead. The wheelchair stopped, and the room fell deathly silent. Then, with a deafening crash, the doors burst open. The shadowy figure stood there, its head twitching violently. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at them. Lights flared, blindingly bright, and the room seemed to collapse inward. The screams of the asylum's past patients filled their ears, a cacophony of pain and despair. The last thing they saw was the figure stepping toward them, its featureless face splitting into a jagged, tooth-filled grin. When the townspeople found the asylum weeks later, there was no trace of the three friends, just the wheelchair, sitting in the center of the room, its straps buckled tightly as though it had been used. The whispers never stopped.
Story number 7.
The rain began as a light drizzle when Harper and Liam set out on the old logging road. The couple was used to hikes through the secluded wilderness near their cabin, but this trail was new, an unmarked path that Harper had spotted the day before. It wasn't on any maps, and the locals had warned them to stay clear of it, muttering something about the Watchers. Liam laughed at the warnings. Every small town has its spooky legends. Let's check it out. What's the worst that could happen? Harper had agreed reluctantly, but now, as the rain intensified and the forest grew darker, she was starting to regret it. The trail was overgrown, winding deeper into the woods than she'd expected. The dense canopy overhead blocked out most of the light, and the air felt heavy, as though the forest were pressing in on them. Maybe we should turn back, she suggested, her voice strained. Come on, Liam said, nudging her playfully. We've come this far, just a little further. The path abruptly opened into a clearing. At its center stood a massive stone, weathered and cracked, covered in strange symbols. Surrounding it were dozens of small, crudely carved figures, humanoid shapes with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. They were arranged in a wide circle, all facing the stone. What the hell is this? Liam asked, stepping closer to the stone. Harper grabbed his arm. I don't like this. Let's go. But Liam's curiosity got the better of him. He knelt down, brushing away the moss covering the symbols. These carvings are old, he muttered. Really old, maybe ancient. Harper's unease deepened. The rain was falling harder now, and the shadows cast by the twisted trees seemed to move. She glanced around, the feeling of being watched prickling at her neck. Liam, she said sharply, something's not right. He stood inside. Fine, we'll go. But I'm coming back here with a camera. As they turned to leave, the forest fell eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the rain. Then came the crunch of footsteps behind them. Harper froze, her heart pounding. Did you hear that? Liam nodded, his eyes darting toward the sound. Probably just an animal. But Harper knew better. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and growing closer. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. At first, there was nothing. Then she saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out from behind the trees. They were humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their skin as pale as moonlight. Their faces were smooth and featureless, except for two sunken, black pits where eyes should have been. They moved silently, their heads tilting in unison as if curious. Run, Harper screamed, grabbing Liam's hand. They bolted back down the trail, the sound of pursuit close behind. The figures didn't run. They glided, their movements unnaturally fluid. No matter how fast Harper and Liam ran, the figures were always just behind them, their hollow eyes fixed on the fleeing couple. We're almost there, Liam shouted, though Harper could hear the panic in his voice. The trail seemed endless, stretching on far longer than it had on the way in. The trees blurred together, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. Harper's lungs burned, her legs screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not with those things behind them. The rain turned to a torrential downpour, and the trail turned to mud. Harper slipped, falling hard. Liam stopped, pulling her to her feet, but it was too late. The figures were there, surrounding them in a perfect circle. They didn't move closer. They just stood there, watching. What do you want? Liam shouted, his voice cracking. One of the figures stepped forward, its head tilting sharply to the side. It raised a bony hand and pointed toward the clearing they had just left. The message was clear. Okay, Harper whispered. We'll go back. We'll fix whatever we did. The figures didn't respond, but the circle widened just enough for them to pass through. Trembling, Harper and Liam retraced their steps, the figures gliding silently behind them. When they reached the clearing, the circle of small statues seemed different, rearranged with two new figures added to their ranks. It took Harper a moment to realize what was wrong. Two of the figures now bore a striking resemblance to her and Liam. The stone at the center of the clearing began to hum, a low vibration that resonated in Harper's chest. The figures surrounding them retreated, melting back into the shadows, leaving Harper and Liam alone with the carved effigies. Let's go, Harper whispered, tears streaming down her face. But when they turned to leave, the path was gone. The woods closed in around them, and the forest came alive with whispers. The next morning, a local search party found the couple's abandoned car near the edge of the woods. They never found Harper or Liam, but those who dared to venture into the forest claimed the stone now had two more carvings, their faces frozen in silent screams. No one takes the unmarked path anymore.
Story number 8.
The Wilbur house sat at the edge of town, shrouded in decay and a reputation darker than its cracked, ivy-choked walls. No one had lived there for decades, not since the last owner, a recluse named Samuel Wilbur, vanished without a trace. Stories about the house circulated in hushed tones, lights flickering in the windows, shadows moving past the glass, and the faint sound of someone weeping late at night. So when Lisa, a journalist chasing a story on haunted houses, decided to spend the night there, the entire town called her crazy. "It's just an old house," she told her friends as she packed her bag with a flashlight, notebook, and camera. "These stories are all exaggerations." She arrived just before sunset, the sky bruised with ominous clouds. The house loomed like a skeletal giant, its windows dark and empty. The door creaked open with little resistance, as if inviting her in. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Her footsteps echoed as she moved through the dim rooms, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that looked disturbingly like shrouds. Cobwebs hung from the corners, their intricate patterns broken only by the occasional scuttling spider. Lisa set up her equipment in what must have been the parlor, a grand room with a crumbling fireplace and a chandelier that dangled precariously from the ceiling. She began taking pictures, each flash illuminating the eerie space for a brief moment. The first few hours passed uneventfully. She recorded notes about the house's architecture, the strange symbols etched into the wooden banister, and the peculiar way the temperature seemed to drop the further she ventured inside. Around midnight, she heard the first sound, a soft creak, like a footstep on the floor above her. "Probably just the house settling," she muttered, though her hand tightened on the flashlight. She continued her exploration, climbing the grand staircase that led to the second floor. The air grew colder with each step, her breath now visible in the beam of her flashlight. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. She chose the first one on the right and pushed it open. It was a bedroom, the four-poster bed still draped in dusty, moth-eaten curtains. A large mirror hung on the wall, its surface tarnished and speckled. As Lisa stepped into the room, her reflection seemed off, delayed, as if it moved a fraction of a second after she did. She froze, staring at the mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw something behind her, a shadow flitting across the room. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her pulse quickened. She forced herself to laugh. "It's just my imagination." But the sound of another footstep, louder this time, made her grip the flashlight tighter. It was coming from the hallway, closer now. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing down the corridor. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The door behind her slammed shut, and the whispers stopped. Her flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out. Lisa backed away from the door, her heart pounding. The room seemed darker, the shadows heavier. She turned toward the mirror and screamed. A figure stood behind her, tall and gaunt, its face a pale blur of featureless flesh, its arms stretched impossibly long, bony fingers reaching for her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The whispering returned, more urgent, almost angry. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark hallway. Lisa didn't wait. She bolted, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. She stumbled down the staircase, nearly falling, and raced for the front door. It wouldn't budge. She pulled and yanked, but it stayed firmly shut. A cold breath brushed against her neck, and she turned to see the figure standing at the base of the stairs, its head cocked as if studying her. "No!" she screamed, slamming her fists against the door. "Let me out!" The whispers swirled around her, deafening now, and the room spun. The last thing she saw was the figure stepping closer, its blank face filling her vision. When the townsfolk checked the Wilbur house the next day, they found Lisa's car parked outside, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her equipment was still in the parlor, the camera showing a single picture, a blurred image of her, standing in the hallway with a shadowy figure looming just behind her. The house is still empty, but the locals swear they sometimes see a woman's face in the upstairs window, her eyes wide with terror.
Story number 9.
The road leading to Hollow Creek had been closed for years, overgrown with weeds and flanked by rusting keep out signs. Locals said it was cursed, the site of a tragedy so vile that the land itself had turned against anyone who dared to trespass. When Mia and her friends stumbled across the road during a camping trip, it felt like fate. "It's just an old trail," Jared said, shrugging off the ominous warnings they'd heard in town. We're not going to die from walking down a creepy road. Let's just check it out, Claire added, curiosity gleaming in her eyes. We can turn back if it's too scary. Mia didn't share their enthusiasm, but she didn't want to be the killjoy. Against her better judgment, she followed. The road was eerie, lined with skeletal trees whose branches twisted like grasping hands. The air grew colder as they ventured further, a sharp contrast to the warm summer evening. The forest was unnervingly quiet, no birds, no insects, just the crunch of their boots on gravel. You think this is where it happened? Claire asked, breaking the silence. Where what happened? Mia snapped, unable to hide her unease. The Hollow Creek Massacre, Jared said, his voice low and theatrical. A family went mad out here. Some say it was the isolation, others say it was something in the woods. Whatever it was, they started killing anyone who came near. When the townsfolk finally stopped them, they found the house full of bodies, all arranged in unnatural ways. Unnatural? Mia repeated, her stomach twisting. Jared grinned. Upside down, hanging from the ceiling. They say the house is still out here, hidden in the trees, and if you get too close, the spirits of the family will drag you inside and make you one of their arrangements. Okay, enough, Mia said, glancing around nervously. The trees seemed to press closer, their shadows lengthening unnaturally. As if on cue, they stumbled upon something, a mailbox. Rusted and leaning, it stood alone by the side of the road. That's creepy, Claire whispered. It's just a mailbox, Jared said, but even he sounded less confident. Beyond it, the road forked. To the right, the overgrown path continued deeper into the forest. To the left, a faint trail led toward a darkened structure barely visible through the trees. Is that the house? Claire asked, pointing. We have to check it out, Jared said, already moving toward it. Mia grabbed his arm. Are you serious? Let's go back. We've seen enough. Jared shook her off. You can go back if you want. I'm not scared of some stupid old story. Against her better judgment, Mia and Claire followed him, the unease in Mia's chest growing with every step. The house was a crumbling ruin, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. The front door hung open, creaking faintly in the breeze. The air smelled of damp wood and something sour, like decaying leaves. I can't believe this place is still standing, Jared said, stepping inside. The interior was worse. The walls were covered in dark stains and broken furniture was strewn across the floor. In the corner, a wooden rocking chair swayed gently, though there was no wind. This is insane, Claire whispered, her voice trembling. We should leave. But Jared was already climbing the stairs, his flashlight casting long shadows on the warped walls. Jared, stop, Mia called, but he ignored her. Reluctantly, she and Claire followed. The upper floor was even darker, the air thick and heavy. Doors lined the hallway, each one slightly ajar. What's that smell? Claire asked, gagging. The stench was overpowering now, a sickly mix of rot and mildew. Jared pushed open one of the doors. Inside was a bedroom, the furniture coated in a thick layer of dust. But it wasn't empty. Figures hung from the ceiling, bound in ropes and draped in tattered sheets. At first, Mia thought they were dummies, some cruel prank, but then she saw the glint of bone beneath the fabric. Oh my God, Claire gasped, backing away. Let's get out of here, Mia said, grabbing Jared's arm. This time he didn't resist. They turned to leave, but the hallway had changed. The doors were gone, replaced by solid walls. The staircase was nowhere to be found. This wasn't here before. Jared stammered, his cocky demeanor gone. The house groaned, the sound deep and guttural as though it were alive. The air grew colder and the shadows on the walls began to move. And then they heard it. The laughter. High-pitched and childlike, it echoed down the hall, growing louder and closer. Mia's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Run, she screamed, though there was nowhere to go. The last thing she saw, as a faint light seeped through the cracks in the walls, were figures emerging from the shadows, twisted in human shapes with hollow eyes and skeletal smiles. The next morning, the sheriff found their abandoned campsite. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, but the trio was never found. Locals swear the road to Hollow Creek has grown longer since then, as though the forest is expanding, reaching for more victims. And at night, if you're quiet, you can still hear the faint sound of children laughing, calling you to join them.